What shall I do? Stem mastering or stereo mastering? Well, the difference between the two is quite simple. Stem mastering is you're mixing down your tracks so that you split them out into, say, drums, vocals, guitars, keyboards, bass, kick. So you have about 8 stems. They get sent to the mastering engineer. The mastering engineer can then put them into a session so they all line up and they play, and they'll play exactly the same as the stereo file. So it's exactly the same apart from it's split into about 8 sections. Now, the benefit of doing stem mastering compared to stereo mastering is that it gives the mastering engineer a little opportunity to rebalance things. So, for example, if when they're mastering they are pushing the track hard into a limiter, that can push the bass down, can push the vocals into the mix a bit more because it's compressing. So basically you can then lift the vocal out a little bit rather than doing it with EQ, which affects everything that's in the same frequency range. It could just lift the vocal. So that's handy for that kind of stuff. But really, if you're really confident on your mix and you're really happy with it, then you should just use stereo mastering, because you want that track to sound, the mix to sound exactly how you wanted that mix to sound, because you've spent ages getting it to sound like that. So send off the stereo master. So when somebody asks me, should I go for stem or stereo, I always say to them, let's go stereo first of all. If I start getting issues and I can't then say to you to solve them, because usually I'll just go back to someone and say, can you turn the vocal up by a dB, and then send me that, and then that's easier, rather than me having to faff around and do all that, and it costs them more money, and it's just a sort of a faff. So it's easier just to ask them to do the tweak and send it back. But if their mix is, really struggling in balance, and because they haven't been able to listen in their room, which is fairly unlikely a lot of the time, then I would suggest going stem mastering. However, the only other benefit of stem mastering, and this is where we blur the lines a little bit with mixing, which is what you've got to watch out for. You don't want to think of stem mastering as mixing, as stem mixing. So I'm not going to start putting effects and things like that on certain stems. That should already be done. That's a big creative approach that should be done at the mix, because the different types of reverbs, different types of delays, different types of compression across different instruments is a real decision that should be taken at mixing stage, not at mastering stage. But what I can do, for example, going back to my vocal example, is I might want to just add a little bit of EQ to the vocal just to say brighten it up, because sometimes if you've got a really bright vocal and a really dull mix, it's a nightmare, because every time you go to brighten up the mix, the vocal gets really bright and hard and really edgy. So what you can do there is you can EQ the vocal differently to the rest of the track, so then it all sits in and blends really well, rather than if you try and say that to the mix engineer, it's very unlikely they're going to understand what you mean, because they've already come to you with this issue and they haven't heard that, they haven't been able to hear that. So if you go back and say, look, the mix is dull, because they're not mastering engineers, so the mix is dull but the vocal's bright, they're not going to hear that because they didn't hear it in the first place. So you're better off then doing that yourself as a mastering engineer. The same goes with sometimes in the bass area, you might want to maybe put a compressor on something just to hold it in place while the rest of it moves a little bit more. So it's that kind of thing that you can do, where it's not really a creative thing as in reverbs, delays, that kind of stuff. And you're not really affecting the balance of the mix too much, but you can do slight alterations to that balance, say half a dB here, stuff like that, based on what you're doing. So you're always A-Bing against the original mix. So I'll always have a stereo version of it, so I can then listen, see if I'm changing it too much, if I'm going too far when I'm doing any tweaks like that on the balance. So you can keep things basically the same, but you might just go, okay, well, I'm going to pop the vocal out, or those guitars are a little bit loud. Maybe if I just pull those back just half a dB, suddenly it sits a bit better and it feels a bit easier after the processing that I'm doing to it. So really it's all based on what I'm doing, rather than just changing it for the hell of it and completely ruining someone's mix that they've spent ages doing. So I would suggest always try stereo first of all, and then go stem. unless you're totally scared about your mix and your room and you're not sure, then I would suggest speaking to the mastering engineer, sending them over a stereo file, getting them to listen to it, chatting about it, and just seeing what is the best way to go. But stem mastering is really a kind of secondary mastering to do as a kind of, you know, if you're having trouble with the stereo mix that they've sent over. So I hope that clears that up. It's not mixing. As soon as you start getting into mixing with it, then you've got to go back to mixing. It's not, they're two different processes. As soon as you start changing the balance too much and having too many stems, then you're in mixing, and that's not mastering. Your head's in the wrong place then, and you're not listening to the veneer. So yeah, hope that helps. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to follow me. And don't forget to go to streaky.com to sign up for the Audio Anoraks newsletter. It comes out once a month. I basically give away stuff on there, that email, and I send you to places that I've seen around that you might like. And also I give you discounts that I get passed by different manufacturers that I can then pass on to you. So it's a good little read once a month. So get yourself over to streaky.com, sign up for the Audio Anoraks newsletter. Till next time, thank you, goodbye.